I was in a coma for a year. Now I don't live the way I used to. I woke up not knowing where I was. The first thing I realized was that I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. Panic surged through me. Was I paralyzed? Why couldn't I move? Everything felt surreal, like a dream, but it wasn't a dream. My mind was awake, aware, but my body wasn't responding. Then the light began to creep into my consciousness. My vision was blurry at first, a hazy distortion of shapes, but as I focused harder, I saw unfamiliar faces hovering over me. Doctors? Nurses? I couldn't tell. I couldn't remember anything. But it wasn't just the people I didn't recognize. It was everything. The room, the smell, the feeling. I had no idea how I got here. Eventually, they told me. I had been in a coma for a year, one whole year, and I couldn't understand it. A year? I couldn't recall a single moment. The last thing I remembered was sitting in my living room watching TV, then nothing. How could a year go by and I couldn't recall a thing? But as the days passed and I started to recover, things started to get even stranger. Memories began to come back, small fragments. I could remember faces, some names, places, but there were huge gaps. More importantly, there were parts of my life that just didn't feel right. I didn't feel like me anymore. It was as though my very soul had been left behind while I was unconscious. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I would snap back into things, that everything would be just as it had been. But it wasn't. I couldn't feel connected to anything. The people who came to visit me were familiar, but I couldn't relate to them. I didn't feel like I belonged with them anymore, and I hated the way I felt. I hated being an outsider in my own life. Then something even more unsettling happened. I began to experience strange visions. At first, they were fleeting, shadows, distorted shapes, a sense of presence, but they became more vivid. I could hear voices, whispers that seemed to be coming from everywhere. They weren't clear at first, just faint murmurs, but slowly they grew louder. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was the trauma of waking up after such a long time, but deep down I knew something was different. I felt it. The voices weren't just in my head, they were real. I could feel their presence in the room, as if someone was standing there, just out of sight, watching me. And the more I tried to ignore them, the more intense they became. And then there was the woman. She was always there, just on the edge of my vision, standing in the shadows, her face never fully visible. I couldn't describe her because I couldn't see her face clearly, but I knew she was there. She had a presence about her that was undeniable. She didn't speak, but I could feel her emotions, sadness, anger, and sometimes fear. She never got close, always remaining just out of reach, but I could sense her. I could feel her with me, always lingering. It felt like I was being pulled into something, something beyond my understanding. I started to wonder if I was still trapped in some kind of dream or if this was some kind of hallucination. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, I couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was trying to communicate with me. I didn't know what was happening. All I knew was that I wasn't the same person I had been before the coma. The world had changed, and I had changed with it. I couldn't go back to who I was. I couldn't even remember who I had been. I was lost. I wanted to reach out to someone to tell them what I was experiencing, but who could I talk to? Who would understand? I could tell my family and friends that I had been in a coma for a year, but how could I explain the strange visions, the voices, the feeling of being watched by someone I couldn't even see? I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own body, trapped in a life I didn't recognize, but it didn't end there. Over time, I began to feel a deep sense of loneliness. I felt like I was disconnected from everything, my family, my friends, my work, my home. Even when I was surrounded by people, I felt utterly alone. The strange thing was, no one else seemed to notice. They went on with their lives, treating me like I was the same person I had been, but I was different. I wasn't the person they knew, and they couldn't see it. They couldn't understand that I wasn't the same. It was a feeling I couldn't escape. I began to question everything, who I was, what happened to me, and what had happened during that year. I needed answers. But the more I searched, the more I realized I wasn't going to get them. What had happened to me during that year? Why couldn't I remember? What was this presence I felt, this woman who seemed to be following me, watching me, but never showing herself? Every day felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't understand. I didn't know if I was going crazy or if something was truly wrong. The boundaries between reality and whatever was happening to me began to blur. Was I truly awake? Was I still in some kind of coma, lost in a dream or a delusion? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer living the life I had before. Whatever had happened to me, it had changed me. And the world, the people around me, it was all different too. I was lost in it, unable to find my place. I was trapped in this strange in-between, where nothing felt real anymore and everything was shrouded in mystery. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how completely everything had changed. I could no longer relate to the world I used to know. My friends, my family, even the city I lived in, everything felt like it was happening to someone else. They were moving through their lives, but I was stuck. I was no longer part of the rhythm. I felt like an observer watching life from behind a glass wall. I went through the motions of everyday life. I would go to the grocery store, run errands, and try to socialize. But it was like trying to wear someone else's skin. I would put on a mask, pretending to be the person I was before, but it never quite fit. The conversations felt hollow, the laughter seemed forced. I could see their smiles, hear their jokes, but I felt like I was on the outside looking in, unable to engage fully. I couldn't shake the sense that I was supposed to be somewhere else, not physically, but emotionally, mentally. It was as though I was lost in a fog, unable to reach the parts of myself that used to feel alive, used to feel connected to the world. And no matter how much I tried to pretend, I knew something was wrong. The more I spent time alone, the more I began to reflect. I started journaling, trying to make sense of the feelings swirling inside me. I had to put it somewhere. I couldn't just hold it all in. The woman, the voices, the disconnect. It was consuming me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The woman who had been with me in the coma, in the shadows, always just out of sight. Her presence was like a constant weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I became obsessed with trying to understand what had happened to me. Why couldn't I remember that year? Why did it feel like I was living someone else's life? The doctors told me that the brain can do strange things when it's healing, that memory loss was a common side effect of long-term comas, but this went beyond that. This wasn't just memory loss. This felt like a fracture in my very being. I started visiting therapists, trying to talk it through, hoping that they would have the answers. They listened, of course, offering their support, but no one could give me any real answers. They told me it was okay to feel confused, to feel disoriented, but no one could tell me why I felt like I was losing myself. No one could explain the visions, the feelings of being watched, the woman who always lingered in the corners of my mind. The more I tried to understand, the more I began to question whether I was really awake at all. What if this was all just part of the coma? What if I was still in it, lost in some strange dream state, and none of this was real? What if the world I was seeing was just a projection, a byproduct of my fractured mind, still trying to make sense of things? What if the woman was just a manifestation of some deeper part of me, something I couldn't quite reach? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, that there was some kind of hidden meaning in all of this. The feeling that the world, my life, was moving towards something I wasn't fully aware of yet. It was like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump, but I didn't know what was on the other side. I had no idea what was coming, but I could feel it, and I couldn't stop myself from moving forward. I stopped trying to force myself back into my old life. I stopped pretending. The more I accepted that I wasn't the same person, the more I started to see the world differently. Things became clearer, but not in a way I expected. It was as if the fog I had been in was lifting, and I was starting to see things for what they truly were. People, places, emotions, they all started to lose their meaning. It was like the world had been drained of its color. I saw the same faces, the same streets, but nothing felt important anymore. I couldn't connect with it. I couldn't connect with them. The woman, too, was still there, watching, waiting. But now I felt less afraid of her. I started to wonder what she wanted from me. Why was she always there, lurking in the edges of my consciousness? I began to feel like we were somehow tied together. She wasn't just a figment of my imagination, a hallucination. I knew that now. She was real, or at least as real as anything in my mind could be. I could sense her emotions, her thoughts, her presence, like she was meant to be there, It wasn't just about her anymore. I was starting to see the world in a different way. It was like everything I had known was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion that I had been living in. Now that I was awake, truly awake, I saw the cracks in it all. The fake smiles, the shallow conversations, the routines that people went through, pretending like everything mattered when, in reality, it didn't. I had lost touch with my old life, but now I was beginning to understand why. It was a life that no longer fit. It was a life built on a foundation of lies, and now I was seeing the truth. I started questioning everything, every decision, every relationship, every part of my past. Was it real? Had it ever been? I didn't know. And I didn't know if I wanted to go back to it. I didn't know if I could go back to it. But the more I tried to figure out who I was now, the more I realized that I couldn't. There was no going back to the person I had been before. That person was gone, lost in the year I had spent in a coma. I was someone new, someone different. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. But it didn't make the feeling of loss go away. Every day I woke up wondering what I was supposed to be doing with my life now. Who was I supposed to be? What was I supposed to feel? I had lost so much, but in losing everything, maybe I had found something else, something deeper, something that was still waiting to be discovered. In time, I stopped searching for answers. I realized there were no easy solutions, no simple way to return to the life I had once known. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the life I thought I was trying to get back to wasn't the life I truly wanted either. It was just a version of me, a version of my past that I had convinced myself was real, but that wasn't who I was anymore. I stopped looking for the answers from the outside world. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't undo the year I had lost, but I could change how I saw things. I could change how I lived. But the question remained, who was I now? And that's when things got even stranger. I started to feel like I was awakening to something new. It wasn't just the loss I was dealing with anymore. It was a feeling of being reborn, of seeing things with new eyes. A feeling that I was shedding old layers of myself, layers that no longer served me, that no longer made sense in the world I had woken up to. Every morning I woke up to a world that felt both unfamiliar and deeply familiar at the same time, and in some strange way it felt like this was exactly where I was meant to be. It wasn't easy and it wasn't without pain, but it was real. And in a world full of falsehoods and illusions, I finally felt like I was touching something real again. The woman was still with me, but she wasn't just a presence anymore. She was part of me. And maybe she always had been. She was my reflection, my shadow, the part of me I had ignored for so long, the part of me that had been lost in the chaos of my life before the coma. And now, together, we were figuring out what this new life was. Not easy, not perfect, but it was mine. The more I tried to adjust to this new version of myself, the more I realized how profoundly different everything had become. The world, my perception, the way I interacted with people, nothing was the same, and it was terrifying at first. For a while, I didn't even want to face it. I didn't want to accept that the person I had been was gone, buried in that year-long void. But in the strange stillness of my mind, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of a thought, but the more I focused on it, the clearer it became. I had been given a second chance, a new life. And with that new life came new choices, new directions. I was no longer bound by the past. The constraints I had once put on myself, my job, my relationships, my habits, suddenly felt irrelevant. I thought back to the woman, the shadow who had been haunting me, watching over me in the coma. She had never spoken to me directly, but I knew deep down she had something to show me. It was as though she was a reflection of everything I had been, everything I was supposed to confront about myself. One evening, while I sat alone in my apartment, I felt her presence stronger than ever. It wasn't just in the peripheral edges of my mind anymore. It was like she was right there, sitting next to me. I could almost feel the weight of her being, her energy pressing against the air. And then, for the first time since I woke up, I heard her voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear at first. It was more like a whisper, but one that felt deep inside my chest, vibrating against my ribs. She didn't speak words in the traditional sense. She just spoke through emotions, through feelings, through memories. And what she told me shook me to my core. She showed me images, flickering scenes from my life before the coma. faces I had forgotten, moments I had buried. And through those images, I realized that I had been living in a lie, wrapped up in the illusion of who I thought I was. I had been pretending for years, not just to the world, but to myself. The woman, she wasn't just some figment of my imagination or a dream brought on by my trauma. She was a part of me. She was the version of myself that I had rejected, the parts I had buried deep down because they didn't fit into the life I had built. She was showing me the truth, the parts of myself I had ignored or suppressed, the anger, the regret, the unspoken fears and desires. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel everything. I let myself break down, let myself cry, let myself be angry. I was angry at so many things. The years I had wasted, the dreams I had abandoned, the people I had hurt, and most of all, at myself. The woman had forced me to confront my own darkness, to face the parts of me I had been too afraid to acknowledge. But something strange happened when I let myself feel all of it. For the first time in years, I felt free. There was no pretending anymore, no more wearing the mask. I wasn't trying to be someone I wasn't. I wasn't trying to live up to anyone else's expectations. I was just me. I stopped worrying about what other people thought. I stopped feeling the pressure to fit into a mold I had never truly belonged in. I stopped worrying about the future and what it might hold. Instead, I began to focus on the present, on what I needed, on what made me feel whole, on what felt authentic. At first, it was unsettling. I didn't know how to navigate this new life. The world I had woken up to was so different from the one I had left behind. I had a new perspective, a new understanding of what really mattered, but I had no idea what to do with that understanding. The road ahead was uncharted, and it was terrifying. But the more I allowed myself to be present, the more I realized that I was not alone in this journey. The woman was there, guiding me, leading me, showing me how to walk this path. I started taking small steps. I reached out to old friends, the ones I had pushed away in the past. I apologized for my absence, for the way I had distanced myself from them. I didn't know if they would accept me back, but I needed to try. I needed to make amends. And to my surprise, they welcomed me with open arms. But not everything was so easy. There were still moments when I felt disconnected, when the old weight of the world pressed down on me again. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the doubt crept in, whispering that maybe I was still just lost, that maybe none of this was real. But each time I faced that fear, I found something inside myself that pushed back. I began to trust myself, trust the woman who had been guiding me. I learned to live without the need for external validation. I learned that my worth wasn't tied to the approval of others or to the life I had once known. My worth was tied to who I was in this moment, the messy, imperfect, and broken parts of myself that I had once tried to hide. And slowly, ever so slowly, I started to build something new. Not the life I had before, but a life that was mine, a life that felt real, a life that I could finally embrace. But the journey was far from over. I had learned a lot, but there was still so much left to uncover. The woman, my shadow, was still with me, still teaching me, still showing me things about myself that I didn't know were possible. And though I didn't know where this path would lead, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer afraid. I had been given a second chance, and this time I was going to live it fully. A few months into my new life, I started to realize something else. I didn't need to have all the answers anymore. That was the big revelation. I didn't need to figure it all out at once. The pressure to know everything, to control everything, to plan my life out to the smallest detail, it was all a part of the person I used to be, the person who lived in fear of the unknown. But now I had learned that the unknown was not something to be afraid of. It was something to embrace. It was the very thing that gave my life meaning, that gave me room to grow, room to make mistakes, room to be human. The visions of the woman became less frequent, but she was still with me. I didn't need her as much anymore. I had found my own strength, my own sense of direction. But there were moments, especially in times of doubt, when I could feel her presence, like a silent guardian, guiding me, reminding me of what I had learned. And though I had stopped searching for answers outside of myself, I realized that my journey wasn't over. There were still lessons to learn, still parts of me to explore, still truths to uncover. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was ready. As the days turned into months, I started to piece together a new version of myself, one that wasn't reliant on the past or the person I had once been. I learned to live in the present moment, to be okay with uncertainty, to let go of the need for control. It was terrifying, yes, but also liberating. The old me had always been so consumed by plans, by checking off the boxes, by needing to feel like everything was predictable and in place. But now I realized that unpredictability was what made life beautiful. I wasn't the same person I had been before the coma. The things I used to care about didn't seem as important anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a mold, to be who others wanted me to be, to follow a prescribed path. But that version of myself had been a lie, a carefully constructed persona I had created to fit in, to be accepted, to avoid facing the truth about who I really was. The coma had stripped everything away, leaving me raw and exposed. It had forced me to confront the truth of my life, the truth of my choices, the truth of the person I had become. And that truth was that I had been hiding from myself, hiding from the pain, hiding from the truth. But in the darkness of that coma, I had found a way back to myself. I had spent a year in a kind of suspended animation, lost between two worlds, but now I was awake. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I had shed the old skin that no longer fit and embraced the person I was becoming. Yet, there were still moments when the weight of everything I had lost would hit me. I would see an old picture, hear a familiar song, or visit a place I used to go, and I would feel this wave of nostalgia, a longing for the past that could never be recaptured. I couldn't go back, no matter how much I wished I could. But that didn't mean I couldn't move forward. There were times when I would look in the mirror and wonder who the person staring back at me really was. Who was I now? What did I want? I no longer had the answers, but I had learned to be okay with that. The uncertainty was part of the journey. The not knowing was what made life worth living. It was the feeling of possibility, the sense that I was still discovering who I was and who I was meant to be. The woman, my shadow, still lingered in the corners of my mind, but I no longer needed her as a guide. I had learned what I needed from her. She had shown me the darkness and in doing so had helped me find the light. But now it was my turn to walk forward on my own. She had given me the strength to move beyond my past, and now I was ready to create a future that was mine. I stopped measuring my life in terms of what I had lost. Instead, I started focusing on what I still had, what I could still build, what I could still create. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it, using it as a foundation to build something new. I began to live more fully, embracing the small moments, the quiet victories, the fleeting joys. I didn't need to be anyone else. I didn't need to fit into a mold. I was learning to accept myself as I was, imperfections and all. And with that acceptance came a sense of peace. Not everything was perfect, and not every day was easy. But I had found a kind of inner strength, a quiet confidence that I had never known before. I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. I had learned that life wasn't about having all the answers. It was about the journey, the growth, the lessons along the way. I no longer needed to search for meaning outside of myself. The meaning was within me. It always had been. And as I walked forward into the unknown, I realized that I was no longer the person I had been before the coma. I was someone new, someone who had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, more aware, more alive than ever before. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to live it.